Okay, we should be live.
Bulabinaka, and welcome everyone to plenary number 2. Welcome to all our face-to-face participants in Papua New Guinea, New Caledonia, Apia, and here in Fiji. And welcome to all our participants connecting virtually. The purpose of this plenary is to provide you with a summary of the framework for nature conservation and protected areas 2021 to 2025. And for that, we have a speaker, Mr. James Tremlett, who will take us through the framework. The second part of the presentation, the speaker is Margaret West, the Regional Director for BirdLife Pacific. She will provide insights into the engagement strategy that is currently being crafted to make sure that we remain engaged with all our members on the framework and on PIRT matters generally. At the conclusion of Margaret's presentation, we will hear 3 endorsements, one from Inga Addison, the Executive Director of UN Environment. We will then hear from Philippe Renaud, the Regional Director of the French Development Agency, AFD, based out in Noumea. And coming to you live from Fiji, Nunia Thomas Moko, the Director of Nature Fiji, Maringeti, Fiji. At the end of the presentations and endorsements, I hope we will be able to have time for questions and answers. Let me start off by saying that the framework provides us with a tool that we can now use to action our commitments. We also have that strategy to support our PIRT members in implementing those actions and commitments. A very quick background on the consultative process that was undertaken. James and his team undertook very extensive consultations on the framework and received a very high response rate compared to previous frameworks. As I mentioned on Tuesday, there were several rounds of consultations and workshops. The team talked to over 23 Pacific government agency staff, 9 PIRT member organizations, 8 civil society organizations, both national and regional, plus 28 individual interviews with other regional conservation experts. There was also a desktop exercise that looked at the regional and global best practices for policy frameworks. And the recommendation that was put to the PIRT working group then provided us with those key features that James will explain about the framework. And I'm told by James that consultations are ongoing. And then at the end of it, we should be able to have a framework that we can all own and be proud of. Before I hand it over to James, very quickly, James is an ocean conservationist from New Zealand. He works to find locally relevant solutions to problems stemming from human pressures on the ocean and to support initiatives that engage our communities with the sea. With that, James, you have the floor.
Tēnā koutou katoa, and thank you for the kind introduction, Mason. As Mason said, I've been working with SPREP and the Roundtable on the redevelopment, really, of our regional conservation framework for the next 5 years. And it's been a great honor and a privilege. So thank you for attending this session. And hopefully you will leave with a bit of an insight into the key features of the framework for the next 5 years. So I'm going to begin by giving a bit of an overview of the framework altogether, its scope and its purpose, and then I will go into the few primary features that really shape the functioning of the framework. So what is it? Really, it's the overarching policy framework for nature conservation in the Pacific region. Its purpose is to provide broad strategic guidance for conservation initiatives undertaken by all stakeholders in the Pacific. And it does this by firstly articulating a shared vision for nature conservation in the Pacific, with an emphasis on the interdependence of environmental, social, cultural, and economic domains. It identifies regional strategic objectives to guide conservation action in the Pacific and focuses this work towards priority issues for our region. It provides an intermediary or a bridging function between global and national environmental frameworks. It provides relevant guidance on best practice to stakeholders and conservation practitioners. It ensures coordination and collaboration between entities involved in conservation in the Pacific. And it encourages mobilization of partnerships and resources to address the priority conservation issues across our region. So this is our current framework document. It was adopted formally in 2014 following the previous conference. And has taken us right through until this year, 2020. Previous to this, we had a series of regional action strategies for conservation that had more or less the same purpose and functioning. So the framework is renewed every 5 or 6 years at this conference, following extensive regional consultation. And as Mason said, that consultation is ongoing, and I'll get to that at the end about the current process of consultation that we invite all participants in the conference to take part in. So one of the primary questions that came up during our consultation conversations was, who is the framework for? Who owns the framework and how should they use it? In essence, the framework is for any organization, any community, or any individual that's involved in nature conservation in the Pacific. And it's owned by all these parties collectively. That's the intention. So more specifically, Pacific governments and government agencies can use the framework as a source of broad strategic guidance for the development of national policies, programs, priorities, including their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. They can use it for fundraising and in reporting to funders and global agencies, and to inform their interactions with and expectations of their conservation partners. Funders should integrate the framework's strategic objectives and principles into their funding criteria and their prioritization processes for projects that they fund. NGOs and other international and regional organizations should use the framework to help shape their partnerships with Pacific governments and communities.
Right, we seem to have lost James temporarily.
Perhaps we could play the video clips while we're waiting for him to come back, as changing
Right.
the agenda,
Yeah.
Mason. I'm not sure if that suits you, Mason, but I think that might be a good idea.
Yes, to engage with our audience, I think it might be
Yes,
good.
please. Is that possible, Alex?
Certainly. Is there an introduction to the videos, or should I just play them straight away?
No, just play them straight away.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends, the world is facing three planetary crises: the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis. Biodiversity is declining rapidly, temperatures are rising, and pollution intensifying. While the pandemic may give the appearance of having reversed these negative trends, unfortunately, none of the Aichi targets will be met, according to the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook issued by the Convention for Biological Diversity in September. Climate change has not stopped for COVID-19 either. Pacific nations are no stranger to these three crises. You teach the world and teach us about the ocean, and you teach us about how the ocean is the very foundation of Pacific cultures, of your livelihoods and identities. These crises are eroding that very foundation, the foundation of life. Fisheries are a core part of the Pacific diet and of the economies, and fisheries are in peril due to biodiversity loss. This region is home to some 25% of the world's coral reefs, but these are now threatened by warming waters and by acidification. These reefs provide between a quarter to 100% of people's protein. At the United Nations Environment Assembly in 2019, the first Waste Management Outlook for Small Developing Island States, SIDS, highlighted that these countries are drowning under a sea of waste. Nobody will be more familiar with this than you. That's why I'm so encouraged to see the Pacific leadership through the new Nature Conservation Framework and other Pacific frameworks addressing climate change, addressing waste and pollution. We need this leadership now more than ever. The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is due for adoption next year and should serve as an inspiration for collective action for us all. The United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, we are working closely with the Pacific to ensure that initiatives here are connected to the global environment agenda. We committed $1.8 million to support the Noumea Convention, the Regional Seas Convention for the Protection of the Sustainable Use of the Pacific Islands region. We work with SPREP on the Pacific Islands Marine Litter Action Plan approved in 2018. This action plan is currently being implemented through national policies, through legislation, through partnership projects, such as the Australian-funded Pacific Ocean Litter Program. The Moana Taka partnership between SPREP and Swire Shipping, which was brokered by UNEP, provides free shipping of waste to ports in Australia, New Zealand, and Asia for recycling and safe disposal. UNEP is supporting a coral reef monitoring, invasive species management, and traditional knowledge management of natural resources, amongst other initiatives. A number of these projects have or will receive Global Environment Facility funding or Green Climate Fund financial support. We were proud to support the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, which analyzed data from 129 islands covering 19 countries or territories, the most comprehensive data set for coral reefs assembled for the region. We're working with the Pacific Islands governments and partners to formulate a regional GEF7 International Waters program to advocate and enable and pilot sustainable blue economy approaches, and we're very hopeful of its approval. These are but a few examples of how UNEP supports the environmental ambitions of the Pacific. The new Nature Conservation Framework and PIRT are essential to address the planetary crisis, to align the Pacific with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We will do our best to ensure that the Pacific initiatives are connected and contributing to the global agenda of the multilateral environmental agreements linked to UNEP. I wish you well for your consultations and for the adoption of the new Pacific Islands Framework for Nature Conservation and Protected Areas. We look forward to advancing these ambitions together. Thank you, and Bula Vinaka.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That was Inga Anderson, the Executive Director of UN Environment. I will now hand over to James. James, you may continue. Thank you.
Thanks, Mason, and apologies everyone again for the delay. Just to see. Oops. Sorry, everyone. Here we go. Yes, apologies once again. We had some technical difficulties here at this end. But to continue from where I left off. So we were talking, I believe, about non-governmental organizations and international and regional organizations and how they might use the framework. Essentially, we expect that those organizations should use the framework to help shape their partnerships with Pacific governments and communities, for priority setting, for project scoping and development, for reference when drafting their own strategic plans, in fundraising and in reporting to funders and global agencies, and to guide their collaboration with other regional organizations. Private sector organizations may draw on the framework to help guide their adoption of sustainable business practices, to clarify their environmental responsibilities in the Pacific, and to inform any conservation partnerships they may undertake with Pacific governments or communities. And finally, and I think perhaps most importantly, communities and civil society can use the framework to hold organizations of various kinds accountable, to hold them accountable about their partnership responsibilities and their commitments to conservation action. I'm now going to go through some of the key features of the draft framework for 2021 to 2025. And starting with this 30-year ambition for Pacific conservation. So in 2002, this conference was held in person in Rarotonga. And at that conference, delegates adopted this framework or this ambition for conservation in the Pacific. It has a vision statement characterized as healthy oceans, healthy islands, healthy people. It has a mission statement to protect and preserve the rich natural and cultural heritage of the Pacific Islands forever for the benefit of the people of the Pacific and the world. And it has 3 goals on environment, on society, and on economy. And these have remained the foundation of all the action strategies and frameworks since 2002. The vision was expanded somewhat several years ago, but the essence remains the same. In this process, we have not proposed any changes to this 30-year ambition, and that's out of respect for the process and the people that created it. Some of those people will be here in this conference today, and some have passed on, and we consider it appropriate that this continues to be the foundation for our collective work over the next 5 years. The next key feature of the framework are these 8 principles for conservation implementation. Essentially, the principles are a code of conduct for implementing conservation initiatives in Pacific contexts. They're designed as a guide for designing, establishing, delivering, and sustaining conservation in the Pacific. They specify the responsibilities of different types of organizations and stakeholders. And importantly, they apply to all conservation initiatives undertaken in our region, and not only those that make explicit links to the framework. It's expected that application of these principles will lead to enriched, more respectful relationships between conservation agencies and Pacific communities, and to a significant improvement in the conservation capacity of our region, with corresponding progress towards the vision and goals of the framework. And the principles are another legacy from previous frameworks updated for the next 5 years. I will go a little bit into the content of those principles. So the 8 principles are, firstly, community rights. And that's really a recognition that Pacific Indigenous and local communities have the right to own, to use, to manage, and to conserve their natural resources and wider environment. Secondly, conservation from Pacific perspectives. This principle recognizes that natural environments are central to the cultures, identities, livelihoods, and development opportunities of Pacific communities. Nature conservation affects all aspects of social, cultural, and economic life, and must therefore align with the values, priorities, and aspirations of these communities. Thirdly, ownership of conservation programs. Lasting conservation in the Pacific, of course, can only be achieved if national partners and local communities lead the design, implementation, and evaluation of conservation initiatives. Fourth, resourcing for longevity. Conservation initiatives must be adequately and appropriately resourced over time by planning for the financial, social, organizational, and cultural components of project longevity. Next, good governance and accountability. Conservation must be inclusive, participatory, accountable, transparent, equitable, and open to stakeholder scrutiny. Coordination and collaboration. Conservation is more effective when partners coordinate, collaborate, and work within a common strategic framework. Next, growing Pacific capacity. The idea that national, subnational, and community capacity to design, prioritize, direct, manage, implement, monitor, and evaluate conservation programs is a real priority. And that existing Pacific capacity must be recognized by all other organizations. And finally, and feeling more and more relevant this year, is reinforcing resilience. Implementing nature conservation that supports the resilience and well-being of Pacific communities in the face of sudden or long-term disruption. So for each principle, we also have more detail about what this principle entails and the obligations and expectations of different kinds of stakeholders. And we don't have time to go through all of this in this session, but this is an example of the kind of detail that the draft framework has for each principle. And I'll send you a link to the draft framework at the end of the session. The third key component of the new framework are the 6 strategic objectives for 2021 to 2025. So these are broad priorities for nature conservation action in the Pacific. Their purpose is to provide a coordinated strategic approach to conservation across jurisdictions. Importantly, the strategic objectives are not prescriptive. Decisions around national goals, targets, and indicators for implementation remain the responsibility of Pacific governments supported by their partners. You will notice that the draft framework therefore does not have a nested set of objectives, targets, and indicators, such as you might see in a country's NBSAP or in the CBD. And this is to allow countries to continue to establish these in ways that suit their own national context, with the strategic objectives providing some common direction across the region. However, the framework does give guidance regarding the how-to for each of the strategic objectives, and I'll get to that in just a second. So what are these 6 objectives? Firstly, number 1, empower our people to take action for nature conservation based on understanding of its importance for our cultures, economies, and communities. 2, integrate environmental and cultural considerations into the goals, processes, and trajectories of economic development in the Pacific. 3, identify, conserve, sustainably manage, and restore ecosystems, habitats, and priority natural and cultural sites. 4, protect and recover threatened species and preserve genetic diversity, focusing on those of particular ecological, cultural, and economic significance. 5, manage and reduce threats to Pacific environments and drivers of biodiversity loss. And 6, grow Pacific capacity and partnerships to effectively monitor, govern, and finance nature conservation action. So each strategic objective is accompanied by action tracks representing the priority areas for implementation across the region. So these are the same as the 21 action tracks from this conference program, and were selected by SPREP based on an analysis of conservation priorities across the region. For instance, and this is just an example, here are the 2 action tracks: our people at the center of conservation action and behavior change for nature conservation. And we've grouped both of those under strategic objective 1. And of course, it's true that many and maybe all of these action tracks could be classed under more than one of the strategic objectives. However, we have grouped them with the objective where there's the greatest or most direct alignment, acknowledging that the nature of our work is such that there's a lot of crossover and that many individual initiatives will be relevant to several of the strategic objectives. As you can see, each action track is also accompanied by summaries of key conservation challenges that are experienced across the region. There are also overviews of best practice for work taken within each action track. And this is a new feature for the framework. It responds to feedback that we received during the consultation. A common message was the request for more practical information about what best practice entailed for the conservation priorities that the framework was identifying. And so this is the response to that. Essentially, the best practice applies the principles for conservation implementation to the achievement of the strategic objectives and looks at what that might look like in practice. And finally, on the right, we have a column where we will identify key regional partners and programs operating within each action track. This information will be presented for each of the 21 action tracks across all 6 strategic objectives. It's a work in progress, and in preparing the final text, we will refer to the insights from the conference sessions on each of these action tracks. And we're also inviting feedback from all conference participants on this section of the framework in particular. And finally, previously, the regional framework has been linked to the CBD through aligning the objectives with the Aichi targets. We have continued this alignment by creating the set of alignments between the new strategic objectives and the 20 targets of the new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And we will update that once we have final wording for the post-2020 framework. We have also demonstrated alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals, recognizing that there's many factors and frameworks that affect decision-making and that the SDGs are highly influential on regional and national scales. We hope that this will be useful to many agencies and organizations in their planning and reporting. So that comes to the end of my part of the presentation. As I mentioned, the final round of consultation on the framework is happening right now. And the target audience of that is conference participants. So if you go to the homepage of the conference, pacificnatureconference.com, and you'll see where I've circled in red at the top there, the button that will take you through to the full draft framework. So you can read every section of the draft if you wish. And then there's also a web form that you can click through to and provide your responses. And so we're specifically looking for further insight into that best practice and the key challenges for each action track. but there's also a section to provide any other feedback you wish to give about the document as a whole, or about the process, or about anything else. There's no word limit or anything for feedback, so as much or as little as you like. So please do take the time to do that. In many ways, it's the most important round of consultation, and we would really appreciate your insights. And that's it from me. And I will hand back to Mason. Kia ora.
Thank you, James. A very thorough presentation on the framework, and I thank you on behalf of the team. I think we had two questions during your presentation. The first one was about consultations, which you've just answered. And the second one was about the principles of the framework. Can I ask Amanda to then use the chat box and answer the questions on the principles of the framework? Without further ado, I would now like to hand over to Margaret West to provide us with an insight into the engagement strategy that is currently being drafted for PIRT members. But before she does, a very quick introduction to Margaret. Margaret is the incoming chair of PIRT and is currently the regional director of BirdLife Pacific since 2016. Margaret's had 30 years of experience working for not-for-profit organizations, providing leadership and management in development and developing markets, directly working in positions as CEO or director in the Pacific and Asian region. Welcome, Margaret. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mason, and thank you, James. It is an honour for me to receive the framework now as a new chair. I think it's really important that we remember that in 2002, the Pacific Island leaders tasked PIRT to come together to create the responsibility for promoting and facilitating and monitoring the implementation of this framework. So we have a very important job to do, and a very big job, as we've just seen from James. I have started already to look at the engagement and communication strategy of delivering this important pieces of work. The PIRT organisations have already met with me, and we've chaired looking at what this engagement strategy will look like, or start to look like, including some of the issues, the problems of before, and we are now looking forward to delivering a much more dynamic and more collaborative environment as we go forward. Yeah, can you go to the next slide, please, James? The PIRT's role is really important in this. There are key themes that we have to look at, and that is influencing the conservation agenda in the Pacific and globally, and that's very important. We just had a high-level meeting with all the governments of the Pacific, including France, Australia, and New Zealand as well, where it was very much made aware to all of us that the Pacific is leading in the ocean and leading the way. But we must engage globally, and the globe must engage with us if we are to solve these issues. Guiding and innovating conservation action, securing sustainable funding for nature conservation. Very important, and I know we had some very good sessions yesterday, and we'll have some more tomorrow as well, where we'll be looking at funding, which is one of the biggest issues, and the word sustainable long-term funding is something we will be looking at. On the engagement strategy, we will specify how we will support our partners as a collective. This is really critical to our success across these three critical areas of work. We're also actively linking with donor organisations already to ensure that the framework is integrated into funding criteria for conservation areas in the Pacific. As James mentioned also, we've had a plethora of meetings over these many months, and James and I have been working closely. We have so much information that everyone has given us, and we're very grateful for the time and effort of all organisations and individuals for your time to make this come to the place that we have now. but we have a huge job ahead of us, and I'm confident that we have the right people at the table, and we will all work together stronger and more collaborative to deliver this framework over the next 5 years. Thank you, Mason.
Thank you, Amanda. It sounds exciting, and you can be rest assured that we will continue to assist you in the engagement strategy and to keep our members informed of the developments in that space. I think we had one question from Chris Neal, I think from Fiji. Chris Neal will send you the framework in a short while. Colleagues, allow me now to move on to the third part of our presentation. We've already heard the statement from Inga Anderson, the Executive Director of UN Environment. I would like us now to hear the statement from Philippe Renaud, the Regional Director of the French Development Agency, or AFD, based out in Noumea, New Caledonia.
Mesdames et messieurs les ministres, mesdames et messieurs les représentants des États et territoires du Pacifique, mesdames et messieurs les représentants de la société civile et du monde économique, mesdames, messieurs. C'est un grand honneur pour moi, au nom de l'Agence française de développement, de m'exprimer devant vous aujourd'hui. Les 11 et 12 novembre dernier, l'Agence française de développement a co-organisé, en marge du Forum sur la paix à Paris, le premier sommet des banques publiques de développement du monde, Finances en commun. Ce sommet a réuni 450 banques publiques de développement. Il est parvenu à la formation d'une coalition mondiale de toutes les banques publiques de développement, déterminées à agir au service de la planète et des populations. Un engagement commun a été pris d'aligner les financements sur l'accord de Paris sur le climat et d'appuyer le processus engagé en faveur de la biodiversité dans la perspective de la COP 15. La déclaration conjointe issue de ce sommet insiste sur les solutions fondées sur la nature qui permettent des co-bénéfices simultanés pour le climat, la biodiversité et les océans. L'agenda biodiversité et l'agenda du développement durable ne peuvent être dissociés et nous devons nous assurer que le financement de la conservation de la nature est résolu et pérenne. L'AFD soutient la convergence climat et biodiversité. Elle s'engage à promouvoir des solutions de financement et d'accompagnement technique qui garantissent une transition progressive et juste vers une économie pro-nature. Une économie qui protège les écosystèmes, qui assure que leurs ressources sont gérées durablement par tous les acteurs publics et privés dans toutes les activités et filières au profit d'un développement humain et d'un lien social inclusif, notamment pour les populations les plus fragiles. En chiffres, l'AFD s'engage d'une part à ce que la moitié de ces financements est un co-bénéfice pour le climat, et qu'en leur sein, 30% présentent des co-bénéfices pour la biodiversité. D'ici 2025, l'AFD va doubler ses investissements en faveur de la biodiversité, les portant à 1 milliard d'euros. En Océanie, la France, à travers l'AFD, l'Union européenne, le Canada, l'Australie et la Nouvelle-Zélande ont mis en place l'initiative Kiwa dans le cadre d'un partenariat innovant. Cette initiative, dotée de 35 millions d'euros en subventions, appuie les acteurs du Pacifique dans la préservation de leur biodiversité, en faveur de l'adaptation aux effets du changement climatique, à travers des solutions fondées sur la nature. L'initiative rassemble 5 bailleurs internationaux et 3 organisations régionales que sont le PROE, la CPS et l'UICN. Le cadre océanien 2021-2025 pour la conservation de la nature, ainsi que l'action de la table ronde des îles du Pacifique, renforceront la capacité des bailleurs internationaux à agir rapidement, de façon cohérente et concertée avec nos partenaires du Pacifique, afin de sauvegarder ce capital naturel et culturel inestimable. L'action de tous sera nécessaire et l'AFD s'inscrit pleinement dans la vision partagée de ce nouveau cadre. Votre détermination en faveur de la préservation de cette biodiversité exceptionnelle dépasse les limites de notre océan et influence la communauté internationale dans son ensemble. Je tiens, au nom de l'AFD, à vous féliciter pour votre leadership et à vous assurer que nous serons à vos côtés pour relever ensemble ce défi. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Philip. Thank you for that statement. Two very interesting developments mentioned by Philippe. One is the common financing by the banks. It will be interesting to see developments on that front. And secondly, he mentioned the QA initiative on which SPREP, SPC, and IUCN are implementing agencies for that initiative. And we will be getting in touch with our PIRT members more on the QA initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, last but not the least, we have from Fiji, Ms. Nunia Thomas Moko, the Director of Nature Fiji, Margitiviti. Nature Fiji Margitiviti is the Fiji's only local membership-based organization, and I have the pleasure now of handing over the microphone to Nunia.
Thank you, Mason. Nisa Mbula Binaka, na Dango Nunia Thomas Moko, government of Tokotoka na Sesenimbua, and a Matangali Wakalo and a Wono Koloko. And no Manu Manu Nusulua, no Kauna Makita, no Korondroni Venesanora, Nisayandra. Good afternoon. My name is Nunia Thomas Moko, and I hail from the family of Nasisenimbua of the clan Wakalo in the tribe Watukoloko. My totem animal is the octopus, and my totem plant is what is normally referred to as the plastic tree, scientifically known as Perinarium laurinum, locally known as Makita in Fiji and Kusta in PNG. My village is Ndronivi, which literally translates to the leaf of the Ivi tree or the Tahitian chestnut, located in the province of Ra. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here on behalf of Nature Fiji Margitiviti and for the opportunity to give a local perspective. This week has been an inspirational one for me, hearing from the many people championing nature conservation in the region. As we move forward into the next 5 years, I cannot help but reflect on what Sir Winston Churchill once said, and I quote, "However beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results," unquote. How far have we come? Where are we going? In his closing remarks on his talk on the action track on environmentally and culturally sensitive tourism, T. Ilihia, Director of Communications, Native Hawaiian Hospitality Association, said, "Focus on the people we love, the generations that are not yet born, because the decisions we make today will affect them." When I introduced myself, I acknowledged my tribe, my clan, my totem, a gift of identity that I have inherited from my forefathers. I'm grateful for growing up in a community, my family, my faith family, my educators and my mentors who reinforced with me and continue to do so a sense of identity and the gift of love. To love all things, to do things with love. We are beings who naturally love and care for each other, for nature, and for our visitors. The new framework for nature conservation in protected areas should be communicated in a manner that we can all understand and own it. The framework should communicate that modern and current conservation practices reflect our respective cultural values and norms. We are not reinventing the wheel. We've simply hastened the process by which we learn from nature by using targeted biodiversity surveys, socioeconomic surveys, genetic analysis of populations, and are using modern tools to predict weather and disasters. Through the framework, we should be communicating to our children that their parents and grandfathers are scientists, and these elders hold a wealth of knowledge that will help our youth design the appropriate technologies for transformative action in response to the multiple accelerating threats, both established and emerging, that are faced by nature and people in the Pacific. I believe that if we can focus on the people we love and with them love those who are yet to come, then we leave behind a people who are resilient, innovative, and adaptive to their changing natural and economic environment. Nature Fiji Marangitiviti is committed to the implementation of the new framework, but I put forth the challenge. Imagine a child who is 5 years old today will be 10 in 5 years. 10 years old today will be 15, and a 15-year-old will be 25. Over the next 5 years, let us not only look forward, but also look back at the results and pave an inheritance that our children and their children will have the capacity to and will be proud to steward onward. I close with the words of the First Lady of Palau, First Lady Debbie Remaniasau, who in her closing remarks yesterday said, "We are all connected and ultimately we are all just visitors on this planet." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nunia. Very inspiring words indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, that basically brings us to the close of this session. If we have any questions, I would like to take them at this stage and open up the floor to our virtual participants and to those that are in the various hubs for any questions. So I'd just like to ask James if you have any concluding words for us.
Nothing in particular from me. Thank you, Mason. Just to thank all the participants of this conference, and thank you, Nunia, for those words just now as well. Very inspiring and very appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. As incoming chair, any final concluding words from your end?
Thank you so much, Mason. What more can you say after a wonderful Nunia takes the stage and sets us all on our path? And yeah, no, I look forward to working and delivering. The framework calls for focus, for urgency, and for greater collaboration. And I'm confident that we at PIRT will be able to grab hold of that and deliver what is being asked of us. Thank you, Mason.
Thank you, Maggie. If I can just conclude the session then by saying we now have a framework, we now have a tool that we can use to achieve the results that we want. And I call upon all our participants to take ownership of the tool, to take ownership of the actions within the framework, and to ensure that when we do a review in 2 or 3 years' time, we will be able to see the results, we'll be able to feel the impact that we have with our communities. With that, I thank our participants, I thank our panelists, and I thank our IT platform, Verizon, for the support for this session. Thank you very much. Bisa Mode, and we will see you in the next session in a few minutes' time. Mode Manda.